Hello, and welcome to Part 3 of Managing Across Diverse Populations. I am Linda Dunn-Jensen, your host in this series sponsored by CIBER at Indiana University. As I've talked about in this series, you know we are living in a global age. Technology has brought the world much closer together. This means that people of different cultures find themselves working together and communicating more and more. This is both exciting and interesting, but it can also be frustrating and fraught with uncertainty. How do you relate to someone of another culture? In Part 1 of Managing Across Diverse Populations, I introduced the notion of culture as an iceberg to get you started thinking about the visible and invisible factors underlying culture. I then presented the wheel of culture for you to think about the many aspects of culture. In Part 2, I discussed Hofstede's cultural dimensions to help you learn more about how you can come to understanding cultural differences. In Part 3, today's presentation, Applying Hofstede's Cultural Dimensions, I will walk through some ways in which you can use your understanding of Hofstede's cultural dimensions to help you manage across diverse populations. As I discussed in Part 2, Hofstede's cultural dimensions are one tool to help you in managing across diverse populations. Just to quickly recap these 5 dimensions. First, we have individualism, which refers to the strength of the ties people have to others within their community. Second, masculinity, which is an indication of the esteem in which the traditional masculine work role model of achievement, control, and power is held. Third, uncertainty avoidance, which refers to the cultural tolerance for ambiguity, unstructured situations, and unplanned events. Fourth, long-term orientation, which is the degree to which the society upholds traditional values. High or low dimensions predispose countries to resist or accept change. And finally, power distance, which is the degree of inequity that exists and is accepted, especially by less powerful members of a group, organization, institution, or the society. Please remember, these dimensions are to be used as a guide in understanding the differences in culture between countries. They are not set in stone. As always, there are exceptions of the rule. Now let's look at some examples to applying these dimensions. Our first example is about individualism. Differences in individualism can lead to significant conflicts and misunderstandings. For example, if an American is negotiating with a representative of a Mexican company for a merger, conflict potentials can happen because an American is very high on individualism value. In fact, they are ranked highest in the world. Therefore, their benefits and how they think about the world are mainly motivating around themselves. On the other hand, the Mexican culture is very strong collective. They are concerned about the welfare for their family, their colleagues, and friends. What then would you need to be aware of in this situation? As you see from this list, differences in individualism may have a number of impacts to be considered during negotiations. One example might be that Americans might be more likely to want to increase in their bonus and maximize earnings, where on the other hand, the Mexicans might want to avoid layoffs for their colleagues. These differences driven by cultural expectations may lead to unsuccessful negotiations unless you're aware of what the cultural drivers are behind these requests. Now let's look at masculinity. If a country has a higher masculinity rating than your own, then you want to follow these tips. Remember, countries that are higher on masculinity respect longer work hours, shorter holidays, and even more travel. Your colleagues are not your friends, and they don't want to be. You want to be concise, direct, and avoid being very emotional in your communication style. People will look at, identify, and judge you on your professional identity. And be open to bragging. Self-promotion is often important in these places. On the other hand, if a country has a lower masculinity rating than your own, then you want to think about these tips. These people value life and work to live, not the other way around. Longer holidays, less hours, less travel, and more family time is expected. Lots of small talk. They will ask personal questions. These personal questions are welcomed and are not considered intrusive at all. Trust weighs more than profit margins. Congratulations if you're having successful family here, and nepotism is a good thing. Now let's walk through an example of how uncertainty avoidance would affect a negotiation. A company from Japan, which is very high on uncertainty avoidance, is considering to make an investment in India, which is low on uncertainty avoidance. So when we think about how the Japanese manager might prepare to deal with these differences in uncertainty. One way is they need to try to be more flexible or open in their approach to new ideas than they may be used to. They need to be prepared to push through their agreed plans if they would be expected to be realized as soon as possible. And finally, they need to allow employees their autonomy and space to execute their task on their own. Only guidelines and resources would be expected of them. Let's think about power distance. Insensitivity to differences in the power distance during negotiations can jeopardize a possible agreement. For example, Austria has a power distance of 11, which is the lowest in the world, and Malaysia has a power distance of 104, which is the highest in the world. Some of the potential issues in a negotiation here could include misperceptions of manners and professionalism. Malaysians might perceive Austrian collaboration as rude backtalk. There may also be misperceptions of trustworthiness. Austrians may perceive limited and highly controlled communications from Malaysians as a signal of foul play. Misperceptions of priorities and the importance of timeliness may also occur. Austrians may perceive the long period of time for Malaysians to reach a consensus as hesitation, symptomatic of competing priorities, or the unimportance of timeliness. Conversely, Malaysians may perceive the quick consensus of Austrians as symptomatic of foolhardy risk-taking. Okay, let's test your knowledge. Which dimension is most likely to be useful to avoid unnecessary conflict in each of these scenarios? Scenario 1. You are on an international team and disagree with your colleague about the necessity of including your superior in a discussion. You have a potential conflict of members of the team depending on how their cultural dimensions is rated in power distance. The second scenario is that you are on an international team and had to make the tough call without the help of your team. You think you're going to be rewarded for your take-charge behavior. In this case, you have a potential conflict of members of the team depending on how their cultural dimensions is rated on individualism. I want to thank you again for the opportunity to talk with you about managing across diverse populations. I'd like to recap 3 of the key takeaways as you continue to increase your cultural effectiveness. Takeaway number 1, remember that cultural norms play a large part in the mechanics and interpersonal relationships at work. When you grow up in a culture, you take your norms of behavior for granted. You don't have to think about your reactions, preferences, and feelings. When you step into a foreign culture, suddenly things seem different. You don't know what to say or what to do. You should also be aware that these potential differences can happen when managing across diverse populations. So takeaway 3, make sure you inform yourself about the other culture beforehand, and then identify their values and adapt your strategy appropriately. I want to thank you for your time and attention. I look forward to our next part of the series, Part 4, an international roundtable, tips and advice to increase your success in managing across diverse populations.